My girlfriend texted, "I pawned your Rolex to pay off my debt. You're rich, you can buy another one." It was my late father's watch. I replied, "Thanks for the update." She was stunned when police handcuffed her for theft, right in the middle of her mother's birthday dinner. I grew up in a house where silence meant discipline, not distance. My father measured things twice, cut once, and spoke only when the truth had weight. I took that into adulthood like a tool I could trust. When I met Lena, I told myself opposites balance. She loved music that spilled out of doorways and lights that photographed well. I loved the sound of a pencil on graph paper and the predictable hum of an old desk lamp. She called it charming. I called it enough. In the beginning, we fit because we decided to. She planned events, made empty rooms look like promises. I built things that carried real weight. When we moved in together, she said, "We will make this place look alive." I said, "Let it first be honest." We laughed. We made space for each other's instincts. Then the red flags came, one by one. Small, bright, and easy to ignore. A bill she forgot to open. A dress she bought for a party we did not need to attend. A card declined with a shrug and a joke about banks that hate beautiful women. I told myself stress made people messy. I told myself I could be patient. Patience, I believed, was a form of love. She said borrowing is not a crime if you put it back. I said borrowing without asking is taking. She rolled her eyes and kissed my cheek and asked to wear the watch to a dinner because, in her words, it made the dress make sense. I stood there with the box open and the weight of my father's gift in my palm. The watch was not just steel and glass. It was a ledger of afternoons of salt on wind of a man who taught me the difference between shine and worth. I said, "Not this one." She pouted, then laughed, then said she understood. That night she wore a different bracelet and introduced me as the man who keeps time honest. I wanted to believe that meant something. There were parties. There was a birthday for a client who insisted on a theme with too much gold. There was a fundraiser where social capital changed hands in the space between toasts. She moved through rooms like light on water. I stood at the edges and learned faces, names, the way promises fell out of people when they held a glass too long. She said I looked serious. I said I was counting exits just in case. She called me adorable. I smiled and practiced breathing in crowded rooms. Debt became a soft word. It sat between us like a cat on a windowsill looking harmless. She said the loan company was unreasonable. I said schedules are not personal. She said she was late by a little. I said a little repeated becomes a pattern. She laughed and changed the subject to a trip we should take when things got easier. I nodded and turned off the lamp and stared at the ceiling and listened to a quiet that no longer felt like discipline. My father used to say a structure rarely fails without warning. Hairline cracks speak before the wall falls. I heard those small sounds and still I told myself the wall was fine. On a gray afternoon, I opened the drawer where I keep the papers that matter. Birth certificates. Service records. A thin folder labeled with my father's initials and mine. Inside it, the receipt of the last maintenance on the watch. The service stamp photographs of the serial engraving, and a warranty card with the kind of ink that never really dries in the mind. I keep those things because paper remembers. I do not ask why. I ask where the trail lives. The law trusts ink more than tears. That became my quiet rule when worry moved in. I started to notice what could be verified. I noticed the way she took calls in the hallway. I noticed the way an envelope from a lender was slid beneath another magazine. I noticed the missing space on the shelf where the box had always been. And I noticed my own breath grow sharper, shorter, and then steady again, as if my body knew before my mind admitted it that something had been taken. She said, "You worry too much." I said, "I count because I want to sleep." She laughed and called me her careful man. I kissed her forehead and told myself that care was still welcome here. At night, when she slept, I laid the folder on the table and opened it. Service dates, names, phone numbers, serial photographs, set beside a note in my father's handwriting. Only 2 words. Stand tall. It was not advice. It was a standard. The module I live by is simple. Paper trail. The stain that does not wash out is a signature. so I made copies. I saved images to a hard drive I do not take out of the house. I scanned the warranty again and made sure the photograph of the engraving was sharp enough to count each brush of the stamp. I kept a list of numbers I might need if I ever had to prove that something was once here and then it was not. None of this felt like paranoia. It felt like roofing a house before the storm remembers your name. More red flags arrived dressed as kindness. She said, "Let us host, it will help my brand." I said, "Our table can hold only so much." She said, "Success needs witnesses." I said, "Integrity does not." She rolled her eyes, then pulled me into a hug, and in that short embrace I felt the space between want and need widen just enough to make a draft. She held my hand at a store where everything smelled like victory. She pointed at shoes and asked if the color looked like a promotion. I said, "Promotions come from work, not leather." She laughed and called me old in the way that made teasing sound like a love language. I wanted to hear love. I heard weather moving in. I kept the folder close. I watched the way the watch box sat on the shelf and the way she looked at it when she thought I was tying my shoes. I told myself the line had been drawn and we both understood it. I chose to trust while also preparing to verify. Trust, I have learned, is not the absence of evidence. It is the decision to delay consulting it. When I think of my father, I do not remember the big speeches. I remember the way he wiped a tool clean before he hung it back on the wall. I remember the way he ran a hand along a beam to feel for a hidden split. I remember the way he would pause before giving me an answer, as if weighing it in the palm of his hand. That pause lives in me. It teaches me to wait long enough for the right word, and not a second longer. So I watched. I cataloged what could be cataloged. I said little. She said everything was under control. I said, "If you need help, ask." She said, "I am not a charity case." I said, "I am your partner." She said, "Let me handle my world and you handle yours." I nodded. I wanted partnership. I heard a boundary that did not include me. On the morning before everything turned, I opened the drawer out of habit. The box was there. The weight still where it should be. I ran a finger along the edge and closed it. I believed that meant safety. I believed that checking is the same as securing. It is not. Locks do nothing when the door is held open for the wrong reason. If you asked me when I knew, I would say, I knew long before the message. I knew the first time I chose comfort over clarity. I knew the first time I laughed off a concern because the moment looked prettier without it. Knowing is not the same as acting. Acting requires a line. My line was the watch. My line was my father's name living beside mine in ink that does not fade. My line was the lesson that love without boundaries erases the very person asked to love. When the message finally came, I did not argue with it. The red flags had already told the story. The paper had already kept the truth. All that remained was to stand where the line was drawn and refuse to step back. Stand tall. I did not pace. I did not argue with the phone. I sat at the desk, opened the laptop, and printed every statement that could still tell the truth when voices got loud. Pages slid out warm, ink set. My name. Her name. A list of places money had visited and why. I traced the dates with a finger slow and exact. One line did not belong. A storefront I knew by reputation more than address. 7th and Main Pawn, late afternoon. A charge that looked small on paper and enormous when you knew what changed hands. My jaw tightened, then released. I circled the line with a pen and wrote one word beside it. Go. I took the folder with the warranty card, the service receipt, and the photographs of the serial engraving. I took a breath the way my father used to before lifting something heavy. On the way out, I locked the door and let the click stand in for every sentence I could say and did not need to. Downtown was all glass and reflection. 7th and Main sat under a sign that looked older than the paint around it. Bells rang when I pushed the door. The counter was clean. The man behind it wore patience like a uniform. He said, "Can I help you?" I said, "I hope so." I set the folder down and slid the photo of the case back across the counter. The serial number was sharp, each stroke of the stamp visible like a small topography. He leaned in. He said, "You know what you are showing me, right?" I said, "I know exactly what I am showing you." He asked for the roughly cut facts. Model, condition, any visible marks. I told him the story of a fine scratch near the 20 mark, a story made of salt air and a last fishing trip. I told him I was not here for a fight. I was here for a process. He nodded. He checked a log I could not see. He said, "I cannot hand anything over without a police report. That is the law." I said, "I am asking you to keep it on hold and to tell me nothing you are not allowed to say." He said, "Then we have an understanding." He wrote a note, the kind that anchors an object to a moment. He said, "If a report comes through with this serial, I will cooperate." I thanked him. He said, "People come in angry." "You are not angry." I said, "Anger burns out. Ink lasts." Outside, I sat in the car and called the service center. A calm voice answered. I gave my name, the serial, the service dates, the store where the last work was done, the city, the month, the type of loom, the bracelet reference, the small details that make counterfeits sweat. The voice said, "Please hold." I listened to a melody written to comfort no one in particular. When she came back, she said the serial matched their record. She asked what has happened. I said the piece is no longer in my possession and I am filing a report. Please mark it as stolen property in your system. She confirmed. She read back a reference number for the call. I wrote it in the margin of a photograph and underlined it twice. She said, "I am sorry." I said, "Thank you for doing your part." She said, "Good luck." I said, "I prefer procedure to luck, but I will take both." The police station smelled like paper and old coffee. At the front desk, I asked for the unit that handles property crimes. A woman pointed me to a short hallway where bulletin boards held flyers for block captains and a faded poster about neighborhood watches. A door opened. A detective with a neat notebook and tired eyes stepped out. She said, "I am Detective Marisol Vega. How can I help?" I said, "I am here to file for a stolen watch, and I have brought what you will ask for." She said, "That is my favorite sentence." We sat in a room that did not try to be comfortable. I laid out the documents in the order my father would have approved: warranty card, service receipt, serial photographs. Photographs of me and my father with the watch in frame. The bank statement with the pawn entry circled, and the message that turned everything from suspicion into fact. She read without rushing. She asked very few questions, and each one mattered. Who had access to the box? When did I last see the watch? Had I ever loaned it? I answered plainly. She made notes in a tidy hand. When she looked up, there was no pity in her eyes. There was a professional focus I trusted more. She said, "We will need to confirm market value to determine the charge category." I said, "I understand." She said, "Have you had it appraised in the last few years?" I said, "I have service records and comparable listings from the last time I considered adding insurance to the policy." "I can provide those." She said, "Do that." We called the shop from her office line. She identified herself, gave the reference from the station, and asked about holds and logs. She listened, said thank you, and hung up. She turned back to me and said the item was on hold and had not been released for sale. She would issue a hold request and begin the recovery process. She would also initiate the classification. Her voice did not change when she said the likely category crossed the felony threshold. She explained the standard, the range, the elements that had to be shown. She explained what the law requires to turn a bad choice into a criminal act on paper. I said, "I am not asking you to make a show of this. I am asking you to do it by the book." She said, "People sometimes want a scene." I said, "I want a record." She nodded. She said, "Your evidence is clean. The message, the statements, the serial, the call to the service center, the timeline. That is how we anchor the case." She asked about my relationship to the suspect. I used the smallest sentence I could live with. I said, "She is my fiancée." Vega did not blink. She wrote the word and moved on. She said, "Here is how this works. We will complete the report, place a hold on the item, and coordinate retrieval. We will interview the party who brought it in. We will present the case to the prosecutor. We will keep you informed at each step." She paused. Some people change their minds about pressing charges when the suspect is someone they love. Do you understand what you are asking us to do? I said, I understand the difference between love and permission. She stole. I will not call it anything softer than what it is. She closed the notebook and looked at the stack between us. She said, you would be surprised how many people come in with feelings instead of facts. I said, feelings do not hold up in court. Facts do. She cracked a small smile that did not reach fatigue, and it was enough. Before I left, we made copies of everything for the file. I signed where she pointed. I read each line. I kept my handwriting level and pressure, even the way my father taught me when we filled out the title to a fishing boat with a motor that coughed to life most days. On the sidewalk, the air felt cooler than it had an hour earlier. The folder was lighter because some of it now belonged to a process with its own weight. I stood there a moment and pictured the watch not as a trophy on a wrist that did not earn it, but as an object in a bag with a tag and a chain of custody that would hold. I called the shop once more, not to push, but to confirm they had received the notice. The owner said they had, and that they would comply. He said, I see a lot of stories walk in here. Most are noisy, yours is not. I said, noise is expensive. He said, good day, sir. I said, you as well. Back home, I put the remaining papers in the drawer and slid the folder into the space it knew. I looked at the shelf where the box used to command light. I did not reach for absence. I reached for the pen, wrote today's date on a small card, and clipped it to the inside of the drawer, as if to say, this is when the structure began to hold again. I did not text Lena. I did not invite another performance. I boiled water. I washed the cup. I dried it. I set it down where it belonged. Then I sat in the chair my father built, ran a thumb along one worn arm, and let a single thought rise and settle. Proceed, she called before I got home. Her voice was already tuned for an audience I could not see. She said, this is a mix-up. I said, speak plainly. She said, I only borrowed it to cover a payment. I was going to put it back. I said, borrowing without permission has another name, silence. Then the performance began. She said, you are making this bigger than it is. You know my loan people are aggressive. They were calling during work. I did what I had to do for us. I said, you did what you wanted without me. She said, I am your fiancé, not your employee. Why do you always need to control the money? I said, I do not control you. I count. There is a difference. She sighed the way people do when they need a witness to feel mistreated. She said, I plan to redeem it next week after the event invoice clears. I have a plan. You never trust my plans. I said, a plan does not begin with theft. The call ended with a dramatic fine. She hung up first. Somewhere between the last syllable and the dial tone, I felt an old beam in me harden. The next wave came fast. A text from Lena longer than any apology and shorter than any truth. She said she felt abandoned. She said she had no choice. She said I valued metal over her peace of mind. She said love should be flexible. She said I could be generous for once. I did not answer. I forwarded the message to my email and archived it. Then her mother called. Elaine did not waste time with hello. She said a gentleman does not humiliate a woman over money. Do you understand what your silence is doing to her? She is crying. She is exhausted. She is working so hard. I said, Elaine, I hear you. I will send you something, and I will say nothing else. I sent the screenshot of the text where Lena announced what she had done. I sent the cropped bank line that tied a late afternoon to a storefront with a bell on the door. I sent a photograph of the serial engraving date stamped from the day my father and I documented it for insurance. I wrote a single sentence beneath the files, this is the conversation. Elaine replied with a shorter message. She said, let me talk to her. The tone had changed. Not warm, not cruel, just smaller. Lena tried a different approach an hour later. She said, I am scared. Can we please handle this privately? No police, no shops, no paperwork. She said, do you really want to put a stain on my record? She said, you know how stories grow mouths. She said, we can say we lost it and end the panic. I said nothing. I saved everything. If the heart wants noise, the case needs quiet. She called again. This time she cried at the start. Real or not is not my job to decide. She said, I felt trapped. I did not know how to tell you because you would judge me. You judge me when I spend, you judge me when I save, you judge me when I breathe. I said, the only judgment here belongs to a process. She said, do you hear yourself? You sound like a machine. I said, I sound like a boundary. She told me a story about a girl who had to look perfect to be taken seriously in a room of sharp eyes. She said the watch was just a tool in a bad moment, and she would make it right. She said, say you forgive me, and I will fix it. I said, forgiveness is not a receipt. She pivoted. She said, you are punishing me because you think your father is watching. She said, you care more about a dead man's rules than a living woman who loves you. I said, I will not weigh grief against love on a broken scale. She laughed, then bitter and bright. She said, you and your scales, you and your beams and your bolts and your stupid rules. I should have known you would pick the watch over me. I said, I picked honesty when I met you. I'm picking it again. She hung up. The room did not change temperature. The lamp kept its steady circle on the desk. I put the phone down face first and let the wood hold it. A group chat pinged on my screen. Friends of hers. Friends of ours. Little pop-up judgments from people who had been fed a story in a hurry. Control Freak 1 wrote. Cold Fish another wrote. I scrolled slowly and then stopped. I attached the same screenshot, removed names, and wrote, this is what happened. Then I muted the thread and closed the window. More messages. She said, I can fix this if you just give me 24 hours. She said, do not talk to anyone else. She said, I will get it back, I promise. She said, I love you and you are throwing me away. I said nothing. I will not negotiate with a moving target. I had already placed the facts in hands designed to carry them. Later that night, she sent a photograph of us at a party under soft lights. She said, remember how happy we were. She said, do not let something small ruin something big. I said, the size of the act is measured by the line it crosses. Silence stretched. Then she tried reason dressed as mercy. She said, the police will make this brutal. They will put it on paper and paper lives forever. Do you really want that? I said, paper is how we remember what happened when people forget. She accused me of wanting a spectacle. She said, you want to watch me suffer. I said, I want what was taken returned, and I want the act named. The rest is yours to feel. She asked, do you still want to marry me? I said, I want to marry a partner. She said, I am trying. I said, you are bargaining. The phone lit with another incoming wall of words. In it, she blamed the lender, the economy, her job, my standards, the pressure of perception, the weight of a ring, the cost of a dress someone else wore once, and never returned, the cruelty of time, and the fear of being ordinary. The list was long. The reason was short. I read it all. I did not answer. I exported the thread to a file and saved it to a folder named for the day the story learned to stand on its own. Near midnight, the tone shifted again. She said, please, I am begging you, do not ruin me. I will pay you back. I will sell the shoes. I will cancel the trips. I will call the lender. I will sit with your mother and tell her I am sorry. I will do everything. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. I said, a misunderstanding lives in fog. This was a decision. She said, you are heartless. I said, I am steady. I went to the kitchen and filled a glass. The water ran clear. I thought of my father rinsing a tool before he hung it back on the wall. I thought of the way he said measure twice, cut once, and the way his hands made even a simple motion look like respect. When I returned, the phone waited with a final trick. She said, if you ever loved me, do not make me wear this shame. I said, shame was the price you asked me to pay when you sold what you could never buy back. For a moment, everything in the room seemed to listen. The lamp, the chair, the small creak in the floor that appears when the night settles. I scrolled to the top, looked at the first message that started the avalanche, and felt the strange calm that follows a choice that will not be taken back. Then I did what I had promised myself I would do when noise tried to bargain with fact. I pressed and held. Delete. Under the soft gold light of the restaurant, everything looked perfect, too perfect. The kind of warmth people create when they're desperate to hide the cold underneath. Lena sat at the center table, radiant in a crimson dress, laughing the loudest in the room. Her mother Elaine watched her with pride. To anyone else it looked like love. To me it looked like denial wearing makeup. I stayed near the back, just close enough to see her face, far enough not to ruin her illusion. Detective Vega was already in position, calm and quiet near the bar. We'd agreed when the candles were lit she would step forward. No shouting, no spectacle beyond the truth. The cake arrived. 14 candles, applause, phones recording. The violinist began to play a soft tune that floated through the air like something fragile. I could almost forget what was about to happen. Then Vega's voice cut through the laughter. "Lena Hart, you are under arrest for felony theft of a high-value item." The words froze the room. A fork hit the floor. Someone gasped. Lena blinked, her practiced smile cracking at the edges. "This has to be a mistake," she said, her voice small, uncertain. "I was going to redeem it. I have the paperwork." Vega's tone didn't change. "You have the right to remain silent." She looked around, desperate to find a script that still worked. Then her eyes found me. "Ethan," she said softly. "Please, tell them." Every head turned. Suddenly I was visible again. I stood, calm. "You did this to my family," I said. "Every time you looked at my father's watch and called it replaceable." Her mouth trembled. "You said you'd help me. You knew I was struggling." "Struggling isn't stealing," I replied. Elaine rose, her voice sharp with anger and confusion. "You're humiliating her in front of everyone." I looked at her. "No, I'm reminding her what honesty looks like." The silence that followed was so heavy it almost felt alive. Even the music stopped breathing. Lena tried to speak again, words tumbling over tears. "Ethan, we can fix this. You didn't have to do this here." Her hands shook. Vega gestured for the officers to move closer. The cuffs clicked around Lena's wrists, soft, final. The sound made someone in the corner gasp. Elaine covered her mouth, eyes wide. "This isn't justice," she whispered. I met her gaze. "It's not revenge either. It's clarity." Vega guided Lena toward the door. The restaurant seemed to tilt around her guests, frozen, half-standing, unsure whether to look away or keep watching. The candle flames flickered from the draft as the door opened, and for a moment, the night air swept in, cool and sharp. Then the door shut, sealing the silence. Elaine sat down heavily, her hand trembling over her untouched glass of wine. "You could have handled this quietly," she said. "I tried quiet," I answered. She turned it into noise. The guests began murmuring, their voices blending into a nervous hum. Someone whispered, "Was that his fiancée?" Another said he had proof. The word proof settled like dust over everything. I walked to Elaine's table and placed an envelope in front of her. The case details. Everything's documented. No surprises. Her eyes searched mine. "You still love her?" "I do," I said. "But love without truth isn't worth saving." The candles were still burning, wax dripping slowly down the sides. Elaine looked at them, then at me. "You've destroyed her life." I shook my head. "She did that herself. I just stopped covering it. I didn't stay to watch the cleanup." As I walked out, the violinist lowered his bow and stared at me with quiet understanding. No words. Just the kind of silence that knows how to hold a truth. Outside, the cold hit my face like relief. The street was quiet except for the hum of traffic and the faint echo of music still trapped inside the restaurant. For a moment, I let myself breathe deep, steady, final. Public justice isn't cruelty. It's the point where truth refuses to hide anymore. And sometimes it needs witnesses. I glanced through the window one last time. Elaine sat alone, staring at the candles still flickering on the table. Her daughter's laughter was gone. The party was over. I turned away, walking into the night. The air smelled like rain and steel. The kind of air that reminds you when everything collapses, silence is the only applause that matters. When the noise faded, what was left wasn't peace. It was the sound of consequences settling in. The night of the arrest had burned itself into memory. The flashing lights, the quiet gasps, the sentence no one wanted to say out loud. But when it was over, when Lena was gone and the camera stopped moving, there was only silence. The kind that forces you to think. The next morning, Detective Vega called me. Her tone was professional, measured, but not unkind. "She'll be charged," she said. "Pawn fraud theft by deception. The item's appraised value crosses the felony threshold. You did everything by the book, by the book." That phrase stayed with me. Because in my mind, I wasn't thinking about punishment, I was thinking about meaning. When I opened the case file later that day, the papers looked sterile, detached. Case number. Item description. Photographs. A luxury watch vintage stainless steel reference number engraved inside the bezel. Market value exceeding $10,000. The words "grand theft" stared back at me, as if I had just learned the exact weight of betrayal in legal terms. Vega had told me before, intent doesn't erase completion. Even if she had planned to redeem it, the act itself, taking, selling, lying, was already a full crime. I understood now that the law didn't run on apologies. It ran on evidence. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of what came next. I didn't want revenge. I wanted restoration. Something balanced, not burned. So I began reading case precedents, legal articles, even the commentary Vega left in the margins of her reports. That's where I came across a line she'd highlighted once in an old manual. "Justice is a measured correction, not a performance of anger." It sounded like something my father would have said. I spent the following week working quietly with Vega and a legal advisor. We discussed options, restitution, plea negotiation, and public accountability. The law gave room for what was called restorative resolution. It wasn't mercy. It was responsibility with structure. If she admitted guilt, returned, the item, issued a public apology, and completed a financial ethics course, the judge might consider reducing the charge to a misdemeanor. The idea wasn't to destroy her, it was to make her face what she'd built. When I thought about my father's watch, I realized something strange. It had already done its job. It was never just metal. It was proof that time reveals everything. That's when I started writing my own statement, careful, deliberate, almost surgical. I described the watch, the betrayal, the steps I'd taken to verify everything without anger, without assumptions. When I finished, I added one last sentence: "I seek restitution, not ruin." Vega read it and nodded. "That's the right kind of strength," she said. The next week, I sat in the mediation room, a square space with cheap chairs and too much air conditioning. Lena entered quietly, wrists free now, but her expression carried the same weight as the cuffs had. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her lawyer spoke first, going through procedure, explaining her willingness to cooperate. Then it was her turn. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I was desperate. I thought I could fix it before you ever found out. I know that doesn't make it right." I didn't answer right away. There's a point in every apology where the silence says more than words. "I don't need you to fix it," I said. "I need you to understand it." Her eyes filled. "I do. I promise I do." I wasn't sure if she meant it, but I wanted to believe there was a version of her that might learn something from the wreckage. Her lawyer placed a folder on the table, a signed statement, a check for the full restitution amount, and a commitment to attend a financial accountability program. I signed my part slow and clear. That was the moment it all shifted. The vengeance that had burned inside me dimmed, replaced by something quieter, something like closure. Outside, Vega walked with me to the parking lot. "You could have asked for full prosecution," she said. "I didn't want a conviction," I answered. "I wanted correction." She smiled. That's rare. Driving home, I thought about everything the last few weeks had taught me. That justice doesn't always roar, it sometimes just stands still and watches people rebuild themselves. That even in betrayal, there's a line between destruction and discipline. When I got home, I opened the safe. The watch wasn't there yet. It was still being held as evidence, but the empty space it once filled didn't ache the same way. Instead, it reminded me of something my father had written in his old notebook. "We don't preserve value by hiding it. We protect it by teaching what it costs to lose." That's what this had become, a lesson in value, not vengeance. A week later, Vega called again. "Case is closed. She's enrolled in the restitution program. Public apology goes live next month. You'll get the watch back soon." Her tone was steady, but I could hear a trace of approval. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet, letting the words settle. Restitution, not ruin. It sounded simple, but it felt like the difference between ending and beginning. I realized I'd spent so much time preparing to punish that I'd forgotten what it meant to repair. Now, for the first time, I wanted to rebuild, not for her, but for me. I thought about what to do next. Maybe speak at a workshop Vega mentioned about financial boundaries and emotional accountability. Not as a victim, but as a witness. Because sometimes surviving something teaches you more than winning ever could. Later that night, I sat at my desk and opened my father's old journal. The handwriting was fading, the ink uneven. One line caught my eye: "Never destroy what you can teach to endure." I closed the book slowly, the echo of his words blending with Vega's earlier advice. Maybe justice and legacy weren't opposites. Maybe they were the same thing seen from different ends of time. When the watch finally returned a month later, it was sealed in an evidence envelope. I opened it carefully, the smell of metal and paper mixing in the air. The steel was cold, unbothered by everything that had happened. Time doesn't take sides. It just records. I turned it over, ran my thumb along the engraving my father had added years ago. Stand tall. The words still meant the same thing. But now I understood them differently. Standing tall wasn't about pride. It was about proportion. Knowing when to fight and when to build. When to let something end and when to make it mean something. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a man who'd lost something. I felt like a man who'd finally learned what it meant to keep his dignity intact, even when everything else broke apart. The mirror caught my reflection as I set the watch down on the desk. The glass was cracked from an old accident, and the split line ran straight through my face. It looked like two versions of me before and after, and for once they both looked calm. When the watch finally came home, it arrived in a small, sealed envelope with a government label and a quiet sense of gravity. Detective Vega handed it to me herself. She didn't say much, just nodded like this was the kind of ending that didn't need words. At home, I opened the envelope carefully. The steel was colder than I remembered. For months, that watch had been sitting behind glass in an evidence locker, tagged, cataloged, detached from meaning. Now it was back where it belonged, inside the glass case on my shelf, next to a printed letter of apology and the signed restitution documents. It looked complete again. Not repaired, not erased. Complete. The apology was simple. I acknowledge what I did was wrong. I betrayed the trust of someone who believed in me. I am committed to making amends. There was no performance in it, and for once, that was enough. For the first time in a long time, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt earned. In the weeks that followed, I found myself mentoring a group of young engineers at work. Bright minds, restless energy. The kind of people who believed every problem had a clean solution. One of them asked, "How do you know where to reinforce a structure before it fails?" I told him, "You study where it cracked last time. You strengthen the pressure points, not the surface." They nodded, and I realized that I wasn't just talking about design. I was talking about people. Each day, I felt the distance growing between who I had been and who I was now. I no longer thought about revenge or loss or even fairness. I thought about balance, about proportion, about what happens when you stop chasing what broke you and start building something that might last. Somewhere across the city, Lena had started her mandatory course financial responsibility and restitution part of her plea agreement. At first, I tried not to think about it, but one evening, Vega sent me an update, a link to the community outreach program Lena had joined after the class. There she was, sitting among a group of people, listening to a volunteer instructor explain budgeting, contracts, accountability. She looked small, tired, but attentive. Maybe for the first time, she was learning instead of performing. I didn't feel anger when I saw her face. I felt something more complicated, something close to release. Because I understood that this was her mirror moment. She was rebuilding in her own way, far from the world that once rewarded her for pretending. I closed the laptop, leaned back, and let the thought settle. Some lessons don't need my presence to continue. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. It was from Elaine. She wrote, "I once believed reputation could protect us from truth. I see now it only delays it. I hope you understand that I wasn't defending her lies. I was defending what I thought family meant. I was wrong. Thank you for showing restraint when I couldn't." I read it twice. Then I placed it in the same case as the watch and the apology letter. 3 artifacts of the same story: the harm, the repair, the understanding. Sometimes healing doesn't look like forgiveness. It looks like 3 pieces of paper side by side, each acknowledging that time moves forward, and so must we. The next morning, I led my team through a new project, a suspension bridge design that required precise stress mapping. As we reviewed the data, one of the junior engineers said, "It's strange. You can't see the tension, but you can feel it if you're paying attention." I smiled. "That's true for structures," I said, "and for people." We laughed, but I meant it. When I left the office that day, I stopped by a local cafe near the waterfront. The sun was setting, casting a long line of gold over the river. For the first time, I saw beauty in stillness instead of distraction. I didn't need to fix the past anymore. It had already taught me what I needed to know. 2 paths existed now, hers and mine. Different, but not opposed. Both learning, both rebuilding, each guided by the same silent rule: stand tall even when it hurts. And maybe that was the quiet symmetry of life. How 2 people could break the same truth and still walk away with entirely different versions of redemption. I looked at the reflection of the water and saw something clear. It wasn't pride. It wasn't victory. It was peace, the kind that comes only after you've stood through the storm and realized you didn't have to win it, just survive it with your dignity intact. When I got home that evening, the glass case caught the last bit of sunlight. The watch gleamed faintly next to the folded letters. 3 reminders, 3 measures of growth. I reached out and closed the lid. For a moment, my reflection appeared faintly over the glass, split between shadow and light. 2 worlds, 2 measures, and for the first time they were equal. At night, the apartment learns a softer language. The lamps dim. The city forgets me. The room keeps only what it trusts. I opened the journal my father left behind and let the paper breathe. His handwriting wanders in clean lines, the kind you only get when you own your time. There is a page I always return to. He wrote 2 words, then underlined them once, like an oath he could fit in his pocket. "Stand tall." I read it aloud, and the sound is barely there. The room seems to bow a little, the way wood does when it remembers weight. People think endings are noise. They think you have to make a speech or break something to prove you have healed. What I learned is quieter. Healing is a measurement. You check the line. You find the level. You stop adding force where grace will hold. On the shelf, the glass case is its own small museum. Inside, the watch sits where it sat before the storm. Beside it, a printed apology and a certificate of return. The ink does not argue. The steel does not apologize. They simply exist together, artifacts of a story that learned to tell the truth. I did not build this case for revenge. I built it like a display in a silent gallery, a way to teach myself that value without meaning is only shine. In this light, the watch is not a trophy. It is a witness. It watched me become the kind of man who does not bargain with fog. It watched denial lose its voice. It watched me choose a road with fewer exits and better signs. On good days, I forget about it for hours. That is a gift. On other days, I catch a glint on the wall, just a blade of light sliding across paint, and I feel the lesson arrive like a tide that knows the shore by heart. The lesson is simple: what you protect reveals who you are. I used to think justice was a destination. Now I know it is a calibration. Too little and the structure leans. Too much and you break what you meant to save. I learned to give the truth its exact weight, no more, no less. The law had a word for what happened. My life needed a better one. Dignity fit. If you asked what changed me most, it was not the arrest, not the papers, not the cold walk to a car that knew the route home without being told. It was the moment I realized I could let the past do its work without standing in its way. I did not have to carry pain to honor memory. I did not have to punish to preserve meaning. Sometimes you protect a legacy by refusing to let it become a prop. I think of Lena now with a gentleness that would have surprised me. She lives somewhere beyond my maps, learning or pretending to learn, making choices that are none of my business. I do not pray for outcomes. I do not draft her future. I hope only that she discovered the difference between performance and repair. They look the same from far away. Up close, only one holds. Her mother wrote to me once. The letter was careful and weary. She said reputation is a poor roof in heavy rain. I folded that line into the journal because it belongs with the other truths I was late to accept. I do not blame her anymore for the night she tried to negotiate with light. People protect what they think will keep them warm. Some of us had to learn that warmth and truth are not enemies. At work, I teach younger engineers how to listen to a structure before it speaks too loudly. We run models, we move loads, we watch red lines bloom across a screen like a warning that loves us. I tell them the real skill is restraint. You never overbuild to impress a client. You build to the moment the wind will come because the wind always comes. They laugh, then write it down. What I do not tell them is that I learned this at a birthday dinner dressed as a war. That I learned it reading a service card with a serial number that outlived denial. That I learned it saying a sentence I did not want to say and meaning it so completely that silence could finally rest. On the wall above the shelf, that stray reflection appears again, the watch catching a line of lamplight, hurling it across the room like a quiet beacon. It looks like a scar you can only see at certain angles. I do not chase it anymore. I let it pass. Scars prove survival, not defeat. I return the journal to its box. I wipe the glass case clean the way my father wiped tools before they went back to the board. Care is a ceremony. You do not perform it for applause. You perform it because things mean what you teach them to mean. People ask, would you do it the same way again? I would. I would file the report. I would gather the paper. I would hold my voice steady under the weight of a room that wanted me to fold. And when the night tried to sell me comfort, I would buy clarity instead. Clarity is expensive. It pays you back in sleep. It pays. There is a sentence I keep for myself, a kind of compass I do not wear on my wrist. What you allow defines you more than what you announce. I allowed the truth to be enough. I allowed consequence to do the teaching I could not. I allowed myself to be a man my father would recognize without needing to ask what happened. Sometimes I imagine him here standing in the doorway with sawdust on his sleeves, looking at the case, then at me. He would not clap. He would nod. He might say, "You measured well." That would be more than praise. That would be permission to go on. I sit, and the chair he built takes my weight, like it was waiting for this exact chapter. Through the window, the city keeps its arguments. Inside, the air holds a stillness that does not ask for edits. The apology letter, the return slip, the quiet watch, they are a choir without sound, and I know every note by heart. There are two kinds of endings. The kind that close a door so hard the walls shake, and the kind that teach you how to leave a room without stealing the light. I chose the second. It took longer. It made better echoes. I stand and walk to the case. My reflection meets me in the glass two halves of a face learning how to agree. I lift the lid and touch the steel with a thumb that remembers salt and wind and a man who fished more patiently than he spoke. The watch does not tick louder for my sake. It keeps time the way truth keeps accounts steady, indifferent, exact. I lower the lid and let the latch find itself. The room exhales. Somewhere a neighbor laughs, and the sound arrives softened by walls that were built right. I return to the journal one last time. I slide a small card inside the cover, today's date written out not for ceremony, but for context. Someday I will forget the edges of this season. The card will remind me how far a life can move between two words. I read them again quietly, as if speaking to the beam that runs through me. Stand tall. I stop there and let the silence do the rest.